Chapter 22 Dragon Mausoleum. It was always pretty disorienting waking up in a different place after taking a good hit to the head. 1 minute Link was fighting that strange knight, then the young man got a real close look at his opponent's shield, and the next thing he knew, he was moving very quickly as he looked up into the dark gray clouds that still covered the sky. The rain had picked up again, and it was falling in waves, which actually felt nice on his face since he was still feeling every inch of the knight's shield that had struck him. The refreshing feeling was ended when something slammed into his upper back, causing him to flip over and get a mouthful of the rocky mud he was being dragged across. Now his situation was starting to make sense as more rocks tore across his body. His wrists were tied above his head, connected by a rope to one of the Lionels that were galloping ahead. He also wasn't alone. Facade was being dragged along in the same way a short distance to the side, and apparently the prince wasn't having a good day either, because his face was caked in blood. So, they had been ambushed and captured, there was still no sign of Aghanim, if he were even still alive, and now they were being taken to who knows where. There was little chance of fighting off the Lionels without weapons, since they had both been disarmed at some point. Not that they would be much good in a fight after being dragged like this. The good news was that they had thankfully left all their chests back at the cave with Impa, and although their current situation was pretty awful, that armored knight did not seem to be around. But where were they going? The Lionels dragged them alongside a river for a time before crossing it, and heading south until a few dead trees began to appear mixed in across the dirt and rocks. Slowly, there came to be more and more dead trees, as well as statues alongside the trail that looked like the ones that had attacked the young man at the thieves' den. All this meaning that they were starting to move away from Death Mountain. Of course, if they went any farther east, it would take them into the old graveyard, and no one wanted that. Thankfully, the Lionels took a sharp turn at the junction in the trail, just as the edges of the graveyard walls were coming into view through the dead trees, and now they were headed up a slight incline. The trails had become old cobblestone now, which was better than random jagged rocks, but this difference soon meant nothing since the Lionels came to a stop once they reached the top of the hill, where a grand entranceway awaited. There were several more of the warrior-looking statues lined up on both sides of the walkway leading up a stone entrance, which was shaped like a dragon's head, with its mouth open so that in order to enter the doors, one had to step through the teeth. It was a great relief to have the strain taken off his arms, but when the Lionels cut him free and pulled him to his feet, the young man couldn't help but cry out from the soreness of trying to put his arms down. Facade was having the same problems as well, both of them groaning and limping as they were brought closer to the entrance, where Darknut was waiting for them. The Lionels kicked them in the back of the knees to make them kneel once they got up to him, and continued to hold their arms, but the knight's attention was not focused on them. Instead, he was looking at the figures now coming out of the doorway. 3 that could have passed for older versions of Aghanim with their blue skin and robes, and then there was the other. "Ah, excellent," Darknut said as the group reached him. "Ganondorf will be pleased by the efficiency of the Wizrobes." Apparently, the Wizrobes had captured the other, since his arms were shackled behind his back, and from his armor, Link could tell that he was a knight of Hyrule, and he looked just like the one he had seen strung up in the thieves' den. He'd apparently also been having a rough day since his armor was dented or missing in places. He had cuts and bruises on his exposed skin, and some blood was dripping from his mouth when the Wizrobes made him kneel. One of the robed wizards then took something out from under his robe, and Link gasped when he saw that it was one of the wooden chests with the royal family emblem. "We caught this one a few days ago trying to hide it inside," the first Wizrobe said as he handed it over. "Of course, he had somehow avoided our detection. The chest would never have been found in 100 years, so we respect his gamble." "Ganondorf will never rule this land," the prisoner said defiantly. "Once King Harkinian discovers the truth about him, he will—" The prisoner's words suddenly became a startled gasp as Darknut drew his sword and plunged it into his chest all the way to the hilt. The other end of the blade was covered in blood when it came out through his back, and stayed this way as the Dark Knight ripped it back out. The prisoner gasped for a few seconds as blood began pouring from both his mouth and the new wound, but then became silent after falling over sideways. But the Dark Knight was not finished yet, and Link could only watch in horror as the prisoner's head was chopped off, and Darknut held it up in the air proudly before tossing it at Facade. The prince let out a startled scream as the bloody neck hit his armor in the chest piece, and even the Lionels were laughing as they let him go in order to watch him fall and stumble before falling on his rear. Darknut walked towards him, presumably to continue the torment, but then it was the Dark Knight who cried out in surprise when Facade picked up a handful of mud and tossed it into the eye slits on his helmet. The prince then jumped up and ran at him, but one of the Wizrobes vanished, reappearing right in front of him with a kick to the wounded side of his face. Facade stumbled back, and then threw a punch at him, but the Wizrobe vanished again, this time kicking him in the back, so that he fell in the mud face first as Darknut was recovering. Annoying to the last. The Dark Knight chuckled while walking away. Now I must return this chest to Ganondorf. I trust that you Wizrobes can see to my little friends here.
Of course,
the second-robed wizard replied.
We will put them in a cell immediately and tell Ganondorf that with all the activities we have planned, these two won't have time to worry about him or the princess.
Darknut nodded to them before chuckling to himself as he walked away and leaving them to the Lionels, who pulled Facade to his feet. Link was also shoved forward, the two of them being moved through the entrance and into a surprisingly clean corridor that was made of white stone. There were several rooms on each side of the hall, most occupied by Wizrobes who appeared to be practicing many of the same spells that the young man had seen Aghanim perform, and each room held many engraved compartments on the walls, as if this place really was an old mausoleum.
We sure hope you boys like it here,
one of the Wizrobes laughed.
And we're sure you will, since our torture facilities are top of the line. However, our living accommodations are somewhat, under par, you could say. And don't tell anyone I said this, but sometimes we forget to feed our prisoners.
Great, Link said nervously. Sounds lovely. They were moved through the corridor, then down several flights of stairs to a much older and more seldom used area of the crypts. There, they were shoved through an open door into a small, dark room, and the door was slammed shut the moment they were in. A set of heavy locks could be heard clicking closed, and then the Wizrobes and Lionels could be heard walking away until there was nothing but silence. Exhausted from everything that happened, Link leaned against the wall and slowly sunk to the floor, and a similar sound was heard on the other side of the room, meaning that the prince had the same idea. Then there was a new sound, one Link had not expected to hear. Facade, are you... the young man asked. Are you crying? And what if I am? Facade's voice answered from the darkness. It would be just one more of the many humiliations I've faced today. Beaten by peasants, captured and imprisoned by monsters, all these things I can handle. But Darknut, he nearly sliced half my face off, and... how can I ever expect someone as perfect and beautiful as Zelda to love me now? Link couldn't help but feel sorry for the prince, no matter how much he didn't like him. So he tried to tell him that if Zelda truly loved him, it wouldn't matter that he had a huge scar across the left side of his face. After all, most girls that Link knew thought battle scars were attractive, but Facade just couldn't get past his looks being spoiled. So the prince just kept sobbing, probably into his hands, because the sound became muffled a moment later, and then yet another sound was heard. Not from the crying prince, but one of stone slowly scraping along more stone. Straining his ears to figure out what it was, Link received the surprise of his life when a torch ignited, and there stood a moblin in front of a secret door in the rear. What? The young man asked as he jumped up. Where did you... Shh! The moblin whispered harshly.
It is a secret to everybody. Now follow me, quickly.